Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gary Jenkins, Dean of the Law School, and I want to welcome you all to Spring Alumni Weekend. And this is the first of many events that we have this week, and I'm thrilled that so many of you are logged on today. Before we begin, just a few notes. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be shared via email following the event. We also have the live auto captioning enabled. So please click on that live transcript feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you want to hide or view these captions throughout today's discussion. So you all, our engaged alumni, are truly a foundational part of our Minnesota law community, especially in light of all of the challenges of the past year. We thank you for your engagement, for your vital support, and your passion for Minnesota law. And before we dig into the substance of our program for today, which is about race and legal education, I just want to start with a word of thanks and appreciation to our great advancement team, especially Lizzie Bugali, who helped organize today's event. So even though we are not in a room together where they could hear the loud, thunderous applause, I know that you are joining me in thanks and appreciation. So, as you all are aware, the tragic killing of George Floyd last summer, the Chauvin trial that's taking place right now, have brought increased momentum and awareness to the ongoing impact of violence against Black communities and the underlying need to address systematic racism within society and institutions. And legal education and the legal profession are most certainly included there. Just last week, the tragic killing of Daunte Wright again brought into sharp relief the importance of this work, of the need for society and policing to value Black lives as much as others. And for the value of our efforts to focus on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in legal education in order to improve and reform the legal system. As I said to our students and faculty last summer and again last week, our institutional values, those that define Minnesota law and that define our profession, they're challenged at times like these, but we will not and cannot be complacent. And as Minnesota's flagship law school, we have a responsibility to support the Twin Cities community through our mission, through what we do best, which includes our clinics, our courses, internships, policy engagement, and scholarship. And we must look for opportunities where we can to bring about positive change, to exercise leadership, to make a difference, and help promote true justice. There is much to be done, complex challenges to navigate, to discuss some of what we are doing and some of the work that we are doing in the classroom. I'm joined today by three distinguished panelists, all of whom continue to make significant contributions in issues of racial equity and justice in legal education, as well as to the broader law and policy landscape. So first, I'd like to introduce Rashaya G. She's class of 2013 and an adjunct professor here at the law school. She has practiced criminal defense and family law at the municipal, state, and appellate levels for several years, but her work now primarily focuses on facilitating cross-racial coaching, providing commentary and insights on racial tensions to news and journalism outlets and helping organizations center racial equity and to operationalize anti-racist frameworks. And at the law school, she is teaching a course called Race and American Law. Welcome, Rashaya. Next, joining us is Professor Perry Moriarty. Professor Moriarty specializes in juvenile justice and criminal justice and race in the law here at the law school, where she teaches criminal law, juvenile justice, and co-directs the Child Advocacy and Juvenile Justice Clinic. Professor Moriarty is a national expert on juvenile sentencing and policy and has served on numerous state and local commissions, committees, and advisory panels focused on juvenile and criminal justice reform. And she is a frequent presenter to the Minnesota legislature and state bar associations. She has deep ties and connections to numerous legal services and grassroots organizations that support underserved communities. And her clinic has a significant racial justice component. And in addition, she and I co-taught a course called George Floyd's Minneapolis. So thank you for joining us, Perry. And our final panelist is Judge Nicole Starr, class of 2003, and an adjunct professor here at the law school. Judge Starr was appointed by Governor Dayton to the bench in Ramsey County District Court in 2015. Prior to her judicial appointment, she was an assistant public defender in Ramsey County, counsel at Helmuth and Johnson, and she clerked on Minnesota's 4th Judicial District and for the Constitutional Court of South Africa. Judge Starr also teaches a course here called Race and the Law, Systems, Structures, and Solutions. So welcome, Judge Starr.
Thank you.
We will reserve time at the end to address questions, and we're going to do that via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So feel free to add to the Q&A function at any time. So let's begin. Let's dig in. And we'll start with a question for each of you. You're each teaching a course here at the law school that deals with race or racial justice issues. Why don't you start by just telling us about your course? Tell us a little bit about what you're doing in the classroom. Judge Starr, can we start with you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Dean, and thank you to the University of Minnesota Law School for hosting this conversation. It is a really wonderful opportunity to bring what we're doing into the classroom to alumni and to a broader community. So the course that I'm teaching is sort of a 2 or 3-part course. The first is to really examine and look at parts of the law that are being taught in traditional classrooms, constitutional law, property law, and think about them in terms of race and racism and try to contextualize them in terms of history. So imagine you're in property law, one of the first things you hear is Johnson v. McIntosh, first in time, first in right, parentheses, except if you're Native American. Many students, both students of color and not, think that is strange. And at the time that I was in law school, there weren't a lot of conversations about that fundamental hypocrisy, right? And then where do we go from that? Because for some folks, that becomes a stumbling block, and it's hard to get past it. And it's hard to imagine yourself within a system that has this sort of hypocrisy. So we look at housing, we look at voting, and we look at the criminalization of poverty. And we use different books and different texts as a conversation piece, not necessarily to get, to understand the facts or to memorize the facts, but more to create a space for the analysis, for where are there tensions and how does that show up in modern day law? And then the other piece of it then is, then what do you do about it? And so the course also encourages students to engage their legal scholarship with people who are doing the work on the ground. So part of it is to talk to folks who are doing racial justice work in housing or doing work around housing, immigration, crime, poverty, child welfare, whatever the topic is, and to sort of ask the question of how could my legal scholarship help the work you're doing, right? So that the university, the flagship school of the state of Minnesota, continues to be of service to the people around us. And that law students really get into the habit of, because we are, right, the problem solvers and the go-to folks in many conversations, so that they become accustomed to saying, I will use my space and power to create space and power for other folks so that the solutions I come up with are not only valuable, but they're relevant to the communities we serve. So that's the grand hope of the class.
Great. Thank you. Professor G, why don't you tell us about your class?
Certainly. I also just am so excited to be here. I have such fond memories of my time in law school. I know that is counterintuitive. People always press me on that point because they want to know if I'm well. And sure, but I am super excited to be engaged in this space with Minnesota. It was such a growing space for me that I am deeply appreciative of the opportunity to facilitate that kind of growth for other students. So my course is Race in American Law, and my class examines the central question, I think, in my course throughout the semester is what has the law done? What is the law's role in the kind of the concretization of race? How did the law participate in taking race from being this abstract idea, ostensibly with no power, to being this mediating force that had exerted significant influence over the evolution of Americans' history, particularly at a time in its formative years, right? I like to call it America's upbringing, right? During this time, what was the law's role in participating in the construction of racial meaning? Right? So what does it mean to be white? What did the law say it meant? Who had access to that whiteness? And how has that evolution changed over time as traced throughout our legal canons, right? Similarly, we interrogate the law's relationship to race, because many students, when they get to my class, have only known the law as, a participant in Jim Crow on some level, maybe a participant in slavery on the constitutional level, but by and large, the law's role in terms of how it engages race has been as a rectifier, right? Has been as an instrument of correction, right? And it's frequently, I think it helps to reorient their perspective when we can have a dialogue about the many, many ways that the law was involved in the participation in this kind of construction of racial meaning for much longer than it has been an arbiter of fairness or equality or egalitarian values, right? And so how has the law allocated resources and burdens on the basis of race? How has the law helped to construct the meanings we now know almost on autopilot in terms of race? And how has the law protected and insulated race on some level? And so it's a class that aims to interrogate in really tangible terms, similar to what Judge Starr said, historicized context. We access a variety of mediums. There is a textbook, but we go through a variety of resources. The students listen to audiobooks and podcasts. They watch documentaries, all because it helps to, I think, add some texture to the dialogue in a way that other law school classes don't, but because I think it's important for us to understand how these constructions came to be. And then also the final part of our class thinks about the law's potential as a fixer. What can the law do? What is the law's potential in the space of correction? And how can we as attorneys be sure that we are vigilant about only using the law in that way and guarding against the way in which the law can be weaponized, specifically, even if we're thinking about what's going on now with kind of the voter laws that have been introduced in many, many states across the nation as a response to some of the mobilizations that we've seen of historically disenfranchised groups. So just having students to think critically and interrogate some of the I think, assumptions that form the foundation of who we are, our identity as a country. We need to actively and intentionally deconstruct that in order to replace it with something new. And I think the class, that's a huge part of the class's aim.
Right. It's so interesting that, I assume that some people, they know it intellectually, but you kind of come in thinking that things began with Brown v. Board, that race began, and that's the story that begins there. But you're unpacking so much that's come before that often is forgotten. I think that's so important. Perry, Professor Moriarty.
Yes. So thank you very much for having me as well. And I just have to comment, first of all, I want to take both of your classes. Having heard about them now, they both sound incredibly rich and nuanced and really thoughtful. So perhaps I can sit in at some point in the future. It makes me really proud to have both of you as grads coming back to teach our students. And again, just glad to be in your company. I'll say a word about the class that I co-taught with Dean Jenkins last fall, and then invite Dean Jenkins to add in anything he'd like to. Our class was called George Floyd's Minneapolis, and the credit for its conception really goes to Dean Jenkins. We obviously designed the class over the summer months for obvious reasons, and I think the dean was inspired, and I'll let him speak to this a bit more, about some work that had been done at other law schools in the aftermath of other similar, I'll say tragedies, but also say murders. Freddie Gray's Baltimore is a comparable class that I think the students really felt strongly about, both the opportunity to participate in it, but really what it symbolized for the state's flagship law school to be promoting the class. And the class did a couple of things, and we may well teach it again. It, in many respects, traced the arc of George Floyd's life. And I think one thing that was very important to both of us was to really humanize George Floyd. I think in the aftermath of his murder, one of the things that I think was very hard for me to see was the notion that this very rich life was boiled down to a particular day and its end. But when you trace the arc of his life and you begin in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and carry forward, his life is in many ways was a map of the way that racial injustice plays out in this country in myriad ways. And we traced that arc, both a bit in terms of his life, but also in terms of its manifestations in Minneapolis. We were very intentional about bringing in experts in areas of housing and education, of policing, of areas of reform and systemic transformation. We were very intentional about bringing in experts of color. We were very intentional about hearing from impacted community members and creating a forum for as many students as wanted to take the course. And I think in the end, we were somewhere in the 70s, although I'm perhaps forgetting, but somewhere in that realm. Obviously, the class was a very last minute posting, and really came together in part because, I'll say the dean has connections to a lot of pretty spectacular scholars around the country who are very willing to step up and step in and speak to our students. I think everyone we talked to, with no exception, said yes. I have ties to the community here, and people were very eager to speak to our students and very happy to have the opportunity. The class was 7 weeks. We compiled readings from our speaker scholarship, but also from the media, from press, videos, really a multimedia approach to allowing our students to immerse in all that had happened to George Floyd, all that happened during the course of his life, and what it means in terms of law. I will, I'll let the dean talk about his feelings about it. The feedback was universally, I think, very gracious and positive. I think students were really glad to be in community with one another. to talk about all that had happened, and in community with people who could speak to the way that the law either does or does not care about these things, and what we can do in the future. I'll just say one word about clinics, since I'm also the co-director of the clinical program. And that is, we have been very intentional over the past 6 months in particular, but even before that, in making sure that we bring race and ethnicity and difference and conversations about competency and what lawyering really means into our clinical program, both in terms of educating our students and our faculty. We have had very explicit implicit bias training, both for our faculty and students over the course of the fall. But we've also rethought elements of our curriculum, created opportunities for students to plug in, both formally and informally, in what's happening here, representing in different points, serving protesters, serving incarcerated persons. I think the program has created kind of a rich fabric of different ways for students to plug in. So happy to talk more about that if it's helpful at all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Perry. The only thing that I will add about our course, or underline, not even add, it's just underline, because I think you said it, is I think one of the things we really wanted to do is have people draw connections between a range of issues: education policy, housing policy. I mean, this is not just a policing matter, but really to see the whole scope of really a system and how they interact together, and ultimately lead to policy solutions, which is what we ask the students to do, to kind of take on a policy issue and think about its role and the difference it can make. But speaking of students, I'd love to talk a little bit more about the students in the classroom, and maybe either, what you've learned from them, or perhaps maybe how they're feeling. I mean, particularly right now, and all of the events of the past year. I think it's fair to say this generation has been heavily impacted by what's going on, by the video, right? Something that was different, right? We might have said this has been happening for a long time, but when we were growing up, Rashaya, right, we didn't have video. We didn't see it all the time. Maybe rarely, but certainly not with the kind of regularity. So, are students pessimistic, optimistic? What's your sense there on any of those kind of questions? I realize I put out a bunch, so you have plenty of things to pick up on. Rashaya, maybe we'll start with you this time.
I was going to stall merely because I have to say one of my biggest concerns, probably my only concern, is that students seem very pessimistic. And I shouldn't say students seem. I'm not sure if it's unique to students. I think we all feel a sense of exhaustion. There are heightened anxieties in our society for reasons outside of race, right? Obviously, the pandemic. Obviously, there is a tense political climate, much more tense than it seemed in the recent past. And then, we just had Daunte Wright, right? A year later. Right. So if we're measuring progress by a reduction in the likelihood of unarmed Black people being killed, then we haven't made much progress. Right. And that feels heavy, overwhelming, even, because it feels like we've been doing things in the last year. We've been working, we've been reading, we've been talking, we've got companies who've put out money. People are introducing new laws. We've had a change in the administration. And it seemed like we're doing the things that we know to do to make a change. And yet we have been reminded very recently that this is still very much, in the midst of the Chauvin trial, right, which we hoped or thought at least would serve as some level of a deterrent. So the students feel all of that. The students reflect that. I think what I've been just immensely impressed by is the analysis, their willingness to grapple with this. I will assign a reading, and then I'll offer supplemental materials to add that context and that texture. And what I've seen is students not only engaging the readings, but also engaging those other materials I just suggest or throw out. Students will come back to class and say, I read that, I listened to that, and here's how I think that adds an element to what we're doing. And so I certainly have been super impressed by their dedication, by their willingness to grapple with this, and by their commitment to this work. But that's also been beset, I think, by the reality that this is a long haul process. So,
yeah. Perry?
So, a couple of things. I mean, I think one thing that's been really important for me to acknowledge, and I do it pretty consciously, is that for our Black, Brown, Indigenous students, is for me to listen and to not presume I understand completely or ever will. And I think that's something that it's a conduit I've been sure to open at the beginning of every class, whether it's a clinical class or otherwise. I'm also teaching an undergraduate Grand Challenges course right now on college and prison. And so we're in conversation with our undergrads as well. And I think, I found that having faculty address what is the obvious in my case, that I'm not a woman of color, and that there are elements of this that I will never feel to the degree that they do. But that, boy, do I want to listen. And that I think it's critical for us to listen. I'm hearing both the pessimism that you just described, but also an element of energy and urgency and optimism. And I'll tell you what I found is that comes to the fore most often when I bring in speakers who have been impacted. I think some of the most powerful moments in the class that I taught with Dean Jenkins came when we had two speakers who were sentenced to life in prison as children, who are out now, who are very active in community and who are actually, doing things like serving on the State Board of Public Defense, who are head of the Minnesota Freedom Fund, who are good friends, but who said to our students, we know that you're tired. We know that you're weary. We know that, this is a different manifestation of the same things that you feel every day. And so do we, but you got to keep going. And here's how. And I think that piece has been important. I'm curious to know if Dean Jenkins felt that as well. But the feedback I got from our students was that Eliza Darris is the speaker I'm talking about, and hearing from Eliza about how to plug in and where to plug in and what to do and what it means and how to get up and to keep going was particularly energizing and allowed them to hold both sort of pessimism and a degree of optimism simultaneously.
Yeah, no, absolutely. An extraordinarily powerful moment for the students and for us. Obviously, as an academic institution, we're primarily in the world of ideas and papers and policy and solutions, but to really be directly engaging with those who are on the front lines of the system, and particularly now to see them, there's no other word than thriving and important change makers in our community, is inspiring. Nicole, how about you?
So the audience will understand this because you're all lawyers or lawyer tangent. I just have to be really clear that I am excited to be in conversation with, for example, Professor is it Moriarty? Am I saying that right? But some of the comments about current trials that are occurring or litigation that may occur. So folks are very clear. Based on judicial canons, I don't endorse conversations. I'm hearing conversation, but I don't take a position on that because of what we believe is important with the neutrality. It doesn't mean that I don't have personal beliefs, but I just really want to be clear that my ideas, I'm glad to be in this conversation, but we didn't like talk ahead of time and then decide what each one of us was going to say. That caveat aside, one of the things that I really think about when I see my students is kind of our learning around emotional intelligence. I promise I'll get to the point here, but this idea that one of the things around emotional intelligence that's important is being able to name your feeling and then express it. And imagine for a second, just for argument, that racism is a public health issue, that it is a disease, that it is similar to other things that actively harm both BIPOC communities and non-BIPOC communities, that it is something that is toxic. What I think is most positive is that we have folks actively naming and letting that out. And I say that because I come from the LGBTQ plus community that for many years, we were in the closet and had a high rate of alcoholism and drug addiction and things because we couldn't speak out, right? And I'm curious, and I don't know, for other BIPOC communities if this is the same, but part of this, isn't necessarily about optimism or pessimism. It's about speaking what is true instead of holding that in and self-inflicting harm. And so I imagine this in some ways, what we're seeing in our classrooms is people learning. And this is one of the reasons I'm so incredibly impressed with the University of Minnesota Law School, that we're learning to talk about race and become conversant in it. We don't have to agree on what it means or how to, analyze case law, but every lawyer in the 21st century has to be able to talk about race and be comfortable in that conversation and have language to both express ideas in favor of whatever's happening and against it in ways that sort of encompass a racial analysis. So to me, it's about students learning the language. And sometimes the very beginning of that language is sorrow and is despair. But I do think it's part of it is because it's so pent up. And we've spent such a long period of time saying, oh, is that PC, which is a great way of saying, let's not talk about it or internalize this or just, I don't know if your family does this, but shove it real deep down in your stomach until it comes out as an ulcer, right? We're now teaching students to do the exact opposite. And I think part of that is learning the language and then learning the emotions around that language.
Yeah. It's that old adage, how to think about or how to talk about these. It's not about what to think, but it's about how to engage on a set of issues.
Jenkins, can I add one thing to what Judge Starr just said?
Sure.
And this is something that I think you and I have talked about. And, what Judge Starr just said sort of brought this to the fore for me. If we're doing this right, we don't have to have a series of specialized classes on race and the law. And I think that is a place that you are leading us. I think it's a place that, other faculty members want to go as well. But this is in and about and around and of every topic we discuss. And I think that's what Rashia's class is about, it sounds like to me. But, it's a bit like Black History Month. It's every month, it's every day, it's every moment and second of every day. And I think that is where Minnesota law will be.
Oh, Professor, I just have to build off that. I think that is, and Dean, that is a brilliant sort of vision, because I love teaching. I enjoy our law students. I mean, for alums out there, our school is in incredibly good hands. Our future lawyers are brilliant, wonderful humans. And it would be great if if race weren't its own separate class, but it was deeply integrated such that the whatever I'm teaching is wholly redundant.
Yeah, it's going to take time to get there. There's no question about that. As certainly, faculty become more comfortable and learn more. But as that conversation we were just having about having difficult conversations, that's true for faculty as well. And we're all, I think, learning and growing there. But that's certainly where we aspire to be, and are working to get there. So let me ask you this, panel. How do you see systemic racism impacting legal education and in turn the legal profession or the rule of law? Right? Is there a link between the work that happens in legal education and how it changes the world outside? And if you want, you can flip that question, right? You can take the inverse of that question as well. In other words, how does addressing equity and racial justice in legal education shape the legal community policy, right? You can see. So I'll offer both sides, and you can kind of take whatever side you think is interesting, whatever you'd like to say there. But can you talk about those connections? Perry, do you want to kick us off?
I can kick us off, but I'm also really interested to hear from others, just on a very sort of a personal level, about elements of it that are not always visible, tangible, measurable, but that I hear about a lot. I think it's impossible to say that systemic racism doesn't impact everything that we do. I think if we're thinking about access, whether it's to the University of Minnesota Law School or another institution of higher education and learning, it's every system that impacts social livelihood. It's every system that impacts education up to that point. It's housing. It's all of it. And I do believe that we can, because we are scholars, measure it in various ways. Those who have access to our law school have had certain elements of fortune and extraordinary hard work, but there are so many others who don't have access, not because they couldn't succeed, and and that's the crisis of higher education in this country in so many ways. Within the legal academy itself, and this is something that we talk a lot about, Dean Jenkins, both in terms of students and faculty. We don't have enough faculty of color. We don't have enough students of color. We specifically don't have enough Black or Indigenous faculty. We don't have enough Latinx faculty. We don't have enough Asian faculty. And that's certainly, is it a chicken or an egg? I don't know, but it's harder to attract students when we don't have faculty. And that plays out in various ways. And so it is multi-layered. It is embedded in how we teach law, how we practice law, how we see law, the role that law has historically played, what legal education is, how it's taught, the language that's used, the people that teach it, the classroom settings, the way exams are written, the names that are used on exams, the examples that are given in exams, all of it's there. I think what I'm really happy about, increasingly happy about, is that we're naming it and calling it out. And that, our students have been for a long time. And I'll turn to Rashaya and Nicole this is decades coming, right? But it's a conversation we don't just have in a meeting designated for that purpose. It's a conversation we have all the time now. We have a lot of work to do, but, Dean Jenkins didn't ask me to say this, but I think having Gary Jenkins as our dean makes an enormous difference in that regard, because it's a conversation that we, again, don't just have because we put it on an agenda. It's endemic to, what we think about, what we do, what we represent.
Thanks, Perry. Certainly we've made great strides in terms of the number of students of color. We've moved from, 5 years ago, to be frank, we were at the back of the pack of our Midwestern peers. And we've increased the number of students by 75%. Now we're in the top third of our Midwestern peers for one class. Now we've got to replicate that for multiple classes, for the 2L classes, 3L classes, make that throughout the building. But that's just the beginning. That's the diversity piece, right? And then there's, of course, the equity piece or the belonging piece as well, and a lot of work there. And of course, faculty of color we're further behind on, as you noted, Perry. And of course, that's a slower process because obviously the class doesn't, like the class, of course, turns over. You get 100% turnover by definition every year. And that's not the case with faculty. So that takes time. But thankfully, we've been able to work with our adjunct faculty and again, so grateful for Nicole and Rashaya and all that you bring to our community there. So let me throw out the question, perhaps to either Nicole or Rashaya. Do either of you want to jump in on the initial question on either side of that?
I can give it a shot, or at least I want to sort of add a second dimension. I agree, Professor, with exactly what you've said. But I would say one of the things that we also have to sort of think about is what happens with the folks we're talking to today, our alums, right? We have folks who deeply want to do the right thing, right? They came to law school because we believe in justice, equality, and when I was in law school, these classes weren't offered. So I think there's a secondary piece of this, which is the law school as a continuing space of education, and that it's as important to engage our alums and create space for folks to. I want to take both of your classes too. This is, and I imagine folks in the audience are like, how do we get in? Where in our time right now, there are not a lot of spaces to have challenging conversations about race that are particularly engaged in our field of law, right? And so the opportunity is, you can join a book group, read White Fragility. Fantastic, you should, but there aren't as many book groups that are like, hey, let's unpack some legal precedent and let's have conversations about why the law looks the way it does today, and look at Supreme Court cases today and how they are absolutely tracked to cases around Reconstruction, right? Like, how does the 14th Amendment continue to play out right now? It turns out there's a whole bunch of people who don't care. They do care, right? But to our alums, we deeply care. And then you try to talk to your neighbor and they're like, nice talking with you, lawyer. So I think there's this real space for the law school to also continue to engage folks past graduation, that every one of us has had an implicit bias CLE, and we all come to this, elimination of bias CLEs, but we don't continue to really engage in the incredible nuances of the law and understand our profession as we're practicing it as both historical and completely, as we sort of live it. And I think there's space for that too. In addition to what Professor Moriarty's laid out. Absolutely, I co-sign on everything you've said.
Rashaya, do you want to add anything?
I'm not sure I have anything of true value to add, in part because they covered so much terrain. So I will also just echo both what Professor Moriarty said and what Judge Starr said, and I will just reiterate. I think that the law school has such an amazing opportunity because of some of what you just articulated, Dean Jenkins, which is that, in this space, we're a space of ideas. The law school is both the law, but also this kind of incubator space where you can do and try other things. And so the law school community is both reflective of societal norms. I remember I often felt when I was a law student that I was the person who was always talking about race, right? I was always going to find the racialized element of whatever it was we were doing. And thankfully, my classmates were, if not supportive, quiet, right? I could not tell you who the non-supportive ones were because they were either supportive or quiet. But I often felt like that discourse wasn't normalized. But that was able to take place in part because I had these other facets. There was a decent amount of us in terms of students of color. I think there were 12 or 13 of us. We had a fairly robust BALSA. We also had professors of color that were a kind of refuge. They were a space, especially for someone like me, who's a first generation student, to go to and say, hey, this seems like there are some middle class norms playing out that are also informed by race that I don't understand or may not have had exposure to. Can we talk about what's going to be expected of me in this space, right? And so it was absolutely a safe, non-judgmental space. So both the critical mass of students, the faculties of color, and then also my own predilections to just kind of always talk about this kind of allowed me to have space to talk about those things that were important to me. But the law school really has the ability to manufacture those dynamics, to create that reality, all three of those things, a normalized discourse, supportive faculty, and a critical mass, and to see what the law can be. I mean, we really have an opportunity to kind of stretch in terms of what the potential of a legal space can be in the law school if we do it deliberately. And so I think that the ways in which the kind of since systemic or institutionalized racism affects the law school, it affects it the way it affects every other institution. The unique thing is that the law school is in this space where it has the ability to think about the law in an idealistic way and think about how we can create and manufacture the circumstances we want to play out in real society. And so instead of being a reflection of what we see in a larger society, maybe being the catalyst for the changes that we want to see. And so that is kind of how I think that the law school can function in this space to kind of be a disruptor of some of those norms.
Great. Yeah. So a couple of questions from the Q&A. So I want to bring some of those into the discussion. And one is a question that might be geared towards Perry, but not exclusively. But it's about the fact that many students, particularly white students, enter law school not really having meaningful relationships with communities of color before. So can you talk a little bit about how the law school, not just ours, but law school in general, but of course ours, can facilitate and support those kind of opportunities and relationship building that is important for people who are ultimately going to go out and practice?
And I don't want to oversimplify what I'm going to say to suggest that, one clinical experience true exposure makes. Obviously, is sort of being proximate and embedded with and having direct experience is something that isn't, isolated. But I do think that, first of all, I think it's, critical to, even in first year courses that have traditionally been sort of more Langdale appellate decision, casebook method classes, that we engage in other ways, so that we bring in speakers, that we do when I teach crim law, which is every few years, we actually go to the public safety facility and watch arraignments. We bring in speakers. We're out in community. We have a long practice class during our first year that I think is meant to be a lot more interactive in that regard as well. And that we bring in lawyers from this community, the alumni community, to engage with our students and engage in different capacities, but also lawyers that bring differences, important differences that are race and go beyond race as well. I think the clinical program, again, I don't want to spend too much time tooting my own program, except to say, if you haven't represented a live client before, if you haven't, been proximate with close to people of color or serve people of color or communities of color, the clinical program certainly provides that opportunity, both in terms of getting to know individual clients, but we go into community. It's not just the cases that we represent. The clients we represent, we certainly do those cases, but we also work on policy. We also attend community fora. We, really try to make it all about the multiple ways that law provides access, that it's truly holistic. So I think the clinical program is certainly a form of exposure beyond just the classic teaching about difference.
Right. And if I could add to that, I would say that it's also our partnerships with so many of the community organizations are so strong right now, with whether it's the ACLU, Legal Aid, the Innocence Project. I mean, I could go on and on.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
So let's see, there's another question asking about whether or not we've seen a decline in applications, particularly of students of color, in light of Minneapolis being the center point of the racial reckoning movement that really started after the killing of George Floyd. And certainly our applications were strong and were consistent. Just to give some context to some of the numbers that I gave earlier, 5 years ago, our classes were roughly 14% students of color, and very small numbers of particularly Black students. And in our current 1L class, that number is up to 25.5. As I mentioned, that moved us from the back of this pack to the top third of this pack, a 600% increase in Black students. But really what that does is that puts us back to the numbers that Rashaya talked about. So we had fallen. We had fallen after 2011 when law school applications dropped by 50%, even more dramatically for students of color. The numbers at many law schools, but particularly our law school, we were hit hard. So now it's kind of going back. The good news is, as of the last numbers I received for next year's class, now remember, I just said our current 1L class was at 25.5%. We're at 25.8% diversity for next year's class. But as I say, until people are actually here on the first day, there's certainly no celebration. Anything could happen through the summer there. But I use that to say, I think in some ways, what we've tried to do is really show that we're leaning in on these issues, and that we're going to be a law school that's going to engage. And I think that that's attractive to some students as well. Not to say that we're perfect by any stretch of the means. As we noted, lots of work to do in many areas and in our community. But thankfully, it seems that I don't think it's accurate to say that we've been hurt by that. So another question from the Q&A is really for everyone, and it's kind of about, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but what's the responsibility that the law school has to bring this kind of education? I think there's so much excitement about the courses that that everyone's teaching, that we're all teaching, to our alumni, to our 13,000 alumni, to the legal community. What can we do to just help lawyers hear each other?
I think there was a real push at some point to think about diversity and inclusion in law firms and across the legal field. And I think that really took away from the intellectual piece of it, because when you were thinking about D&I, one of the big things that a lot of places did was make the business case for diversity and inclusion, which in some ways makes an incredible amount of sense. It is the law and business, right? But for folks who are curious about the topic and who are curious in digging in, I think the responsibility of the law school, that there is an incredible opportunity and hunger in our communities to dig in deeper around these issues, and not in terms of how do we act in a workplace and what's the business case for this, but actually like how can I explain now? And how do I talk to my uncle during Thanksgiving? And how can I be conversant with somebody who agrees or disagrees with me? How do we have these conversations? And the law school is a place of not only justice, fairness, right? Like that those are built into what we do, but we teach people how to communicate. And it is like one of the number one skills that we do, how to communicate across difference. And it doesn't necessarily mean race, right? And if our students and our alumni feel like they're falling short in being able to communicate about race, that's a wonderful place for the law school to offer a service and offer space for learning and growth, not about D&I, which is deeply important, but about how do we explain and talk about this moment through the lens of the law, through our own degrees, and talk about it as lawyers and judges, practitioners, consultants. It's a different language. And, I guess I would sort of end on this idea, or at least think about, until we say, think like a lawyer, right? And you stop thinking about Oliver Wendell Holmes and start thinking about Sonia Sotomayor. Like, we have a lot of work to do, right? About think like a lawyer. So, that's where we want to get with our alums and our students.
Any other quick closing comments? How about that? I'll just open it up to any closing remarks before we go.
I just really appreciate the law school creating this space for us to have these dialogues. I cannot stress how important this discourse is for many of the reasons Judge Starr just said, which is the reality is that around race, we have this huge vacuum in our society. There's no formalized racial competence curriculum in primary education. And as many of you know, you can get all the way to CEO or judge or whomever and never having had to grapple with this. We also lack a real infrastructure in terms of rearing around race. And so what we have is the society that has very strong opinions. Everyone has an opinion without the cognitive infrastructure, without the discursive tools necessary to have this dialogue in a way that's productive. And so a big part of the work is arming and equipping our society with the language, with the cognitive infrastructure necessary to grapple with this in a way that's productive, in a way that's critical, and in a way that'll move us forward. And I think that the law school is laying the groundwork for that with these courses, with this kind of dialogue, engaging the alumni community, being transparent, doing the work. So I'm just super happy and excited again to be part of the community. I again loved law school all over again. Now I get to do it as an instructor. And so I just look forward to what's to come in the future. I think that we're moving in the right direction, and it doesn't feel like we're making the kind of progress we hoped, but at least we are moving, which is more than what I can say for where we've been as a society, and also as a law school in the past.
Great. Well, thank you all. I know that we could talk all day, and there's so much more to say, so much more to do to advance equity in legal education. But thank you all for all that you do to strengthen us. Thank you for just being here today, your comments, your expertise, your insights. We are so lucky to have all of you as part of our community. And thank you to our amazing alumni for supporting us and help us advance on these issues. We really literally could not do this without you and without your support. As one of the questions I didn't get to noted, law school is far more expensive than it was when most of you went to law school. And unfortunately, we now get a very small percentage, single digits from the state. So it's about philanthropy that allows us to make legal education accessible, but more importantly, to create lawyers who are diverse and committed to going out and make a difference to people to organizations, to their communities. That's our mission. That's what we do. So thank you for that. And we're going to continue to make sure that they're as prepared as they can be to tackle these critical issues for our society. So with that, I thank most of you for, joining us for your lunch break. And I know that many of you have to get back to your important work, but we have a lot more activities for our alums this week. Thank you so much. Take care. See you soon. Happy Spring Alumni Week.